The story I am about to tell you is one of history, memory, and empowerment. It is a way to remember the women who worked, often behind the scenes, as gatekeepers of stories, curators of knowledge, and political actors. It's a way to remember the largest group and first group of Japan's female graduate students. What do these women from the 1950s and 1960s teach us about Cold War relations between the US and Japan, about study abroad, about how students are similar to those today? My idea is that Japanese female exchange students served as cultural ambassadors and knowledge curators, selecting aspects of Japan to teach to the United States and explaining American ideas and practices in Japan. They did not merely translate American know-how for Japanese consumption, but instead, through their personal experiences and cultural production, they facilitated a kind of cultural cross-pollination. Almost like bees take pollen from one flower to the next, they took aspects of culture from America, from Japan, and combined them to create intellectual fields and empower women. My project stems from my interest in stories, and a lot of my work is guided through interviews. I'm very interested in how we narrate our own lives, how we tell our lives in texts, how we tell our lives in memoirs, and how we circulate our experiences for others, and how we learn from others' experiences. So I let the stories I hear guide my research. I ask why these women studied abroad and how their time on American campuses influenced their personal and professional lives, which I believe are intimately intertwined in the case of female academics. So to give you some background, between 1949 and 1966, 4,713 Japanese students studied at American universities under the best-known government fellowships at the time, Garryowa and Fulbright. Among them were future leaders in diverse fields from athletics to medicine. And if you notice in some of the photos I will show you, women are dressed in kimono. They did not wear kimono to class, and you rarely see Japanese men in kimono in these photos, but kimono was part of the construction of the female student as a cultural ambassador. They were not Japan's first female graduate students. That was Tsuru Haruguchi, who earned a PhD in psychology from Columbia University in 1912. The group I'm interested in are women who studied in the United States under scholarships. Scholarships epitomize the belief of education to improve international relations. And in addition to funding, scholarships provided orientations, networks, and other memorable and important aspects of study abroad. The students who were selected, they were selected for their English abilities, so they were already an internationally leaning population. Garryowa was ministered by the Department of the Army. It lasted in Japan from 1949 to 1952 on the mainland, longer in Okinawa. The first group of Garryowa's fellowship recipients were 53 teachers, and they did not apply to go, they were selected. When applications were opened for the second cohort, more than 8,000 students applied and less than 6% were accepted. As you could see from the map, unlike Fulbright and other fellowships today, the students didn't apply to the university they wanted to attend. They took a test, applied for Garryowa, and were assigned to schools depending on the openings of the schools and their fields of study. So many of these students were sent to places in the United States that couples is the next slide, that students rarely visited. I mention couples because one of the memorable parts of the study abroad experience was the trip to Japan, be it on the Hikaru Maru or the General Collins. But the first cohorts took a big boat to the United States, and it was a time where many of the students met friends, some met their husbands. As one of my informants said, there was not much else to do. Fulbright was established in 1946, but it was not instituted in Japan until after the Garryowa in 1952. And in the first Fulbright year of Japan in 1952, 17 Americans came to Japan and 31 Japanese students went to the United States. Both Garryowa and Fulbright included women from the start. Fulbright included 1 year of study. A lot of it the funding went to pay for transportation. So students needed to find other sources of funding at a time when people could not take much money out of Japan. They could only take around $200 outside of the country. So there were a host of private scholarships available for students, such as this one pictured here, the American Women's Scholarship for Japanese Women. Again, you see kimono at the tea party. Or universities, here Brandeis. Again, women did not wear kimono to class. But they were among the very first group of Japanese female students to earn graduate degrees. And many of them pursued academic careers after. There came increasing opportunities for women to earn higher degrees in Japan after reforms of 1947, but still the opportunities were limited, especially hindered by the belief that graduate education for women was frivolous at a time when the housewife was being instituted as the norm in Japan. The largest group of foreigners in the United States at the time were war brides. But just as education was difficult for ordinary women, travel was very difficult for ordinary people in general in Japan until travel was liberalized in 1964. And I chose my time period of 1949 to 1966 for a few reasons. When the educational reforms of 1947, the Garryowa starting in 1949, the peak of study abroad, the largest number of Japanese students to study abroad in Japan's history was between 1951 and 1952. Also, it was a time when education was used especially to spread ideas of democracy, and there was a different image of the United States prevalently in Japan from the mid-1960s, around the start of the Vietnam War. It was also a time when U.S. interest in Japan was for political and cultural reasons. The Japan of the cultural imaginary in 1950s America was often sukiyaki restaurants, like that one pictured here, or judo, geisha, cherry blossoms. Well, a lot of these students I've talked to, former exchange students, wanted to dispel this image. They felt angry that there was a lack of knowledge in the United States about Japan. But it was a time when the image of a peaceful, domesticated Japan was being promoted, having just fought the war against America. These students came to a very racially divided America, although universities and there were a lot of intellectual advances at the US at the time. They came, especially the first cohorts, after the internment of Japanese Americans during the war. In many cases, they were the only Japanese nationals on their campuses, and some women I've talked to faced mixed public opinions about Japan, especially for people with war memories. For many of these women, it was not the first time that they had left home. Many of them came from Hokkaido, Hiroshima, Kyushu, other places to earn an education or to get a job and earn money in Tokyo before they studied abroad. And I study women who represent sort of different cohorts. The first groups who went have stronger war memories, and those who went in the 1960s perhaps were more influenced by American popular culture, like Elvis films and 17 magazine, than the women who came before. These women, either before they left or when they came back, helped support Japan in historical events, such as the 1964 Olympics or the 1970 Osaka Expo. Pictured here are female translators for the 1964 Olympic Games. The 1964 Tokyo Olympics were the first Olympics that were held in Asia. Japanese was not the national language of the 64 Games. That was English. So it was a time when the United States were rising in intellectual caliber, and the women I've talked to were very excited to go to the United States. They came almost with a naivete. They didn't know what to expect, but they were just willing to let it happen. One thing Gariowa and Fulbright provided for the students were orientations. There was a 6-week orientation when the students arrived in the United States. The orientation was, of course, to help their English, but importantly, it taught the students a very different way of learning. In Japan, many people learn by you memorize the basics so that you know your field and you could build on it. But in America, we argue. We go to class and we battle it out. So for some of the women I've talked to, it was refreshing being able to learn to voice their own opinions. But some of them found it very psychologically draining. What's with all this arguing? There were also orientations that were held in Japan, like this one in 1955, included a skit I would like to show my students called The University Library is Your Friend. And pictured here is a guidebook from 1956, written by 16 exchange students for future students going to the United States, with really important advice, like how to date, how to go to a dinner party. So when women who returned to Japan were often hired for their English abilities, and they worked in diverse jobs, from translating at universities, teaching at universities, to being guides to Tokyo Disneyland. Those who stayed in North America were often hired for their English abilities, Japanese abilities, that was a slip, even if their major had been English. Many of us can relate to this. This happens to me a lot in Japan. Many of my friends and colleagues often ask me to translate something into English or to explain America to them. So I begin to think about English language America in different ways, and I think that's what happened with the women too. They began to reflect on Japan in a broader sense. There's a misconception that the field of Japanese studies was founded only by men who had been trained by the American military. That was only part of the picture. There was a lack of knowledge between the two countries after the war, and some former female study abroad students helped to fill that gap. So in 1 minute, I'd just like to profile one of these founding mothers of Japanese studies. This is my colleague at the University of Oregon, Yoko McLean, who came to the University of Oregon in 1952 on a Gariowa grant. She had a very famous grandfather in Japan, the author, Natsume Soseki. Yoko McLean wanted to study English because she wanted to write love letters to her favorite movie star, Tyrone Power. Do you agree with her taste? So she attended Tsuda University in 1942. And she attended during the war, and classes were closed, not just at Tsuda University, but other schools, and students were mobilized for the war effort. The president of Tsuda University created factories on campus to keep the students safe. So Yoko only had 2 years of classes. After the war, she worked for American Armed Forces Radio, and she took the Gariowa application and exam at the urging of a friend, who sadly was not accepted. Yoko really wanted to go to the East Coast, thinking she would land in Seattle, not on the Hikaru Maru, sadly, but she took a plane, and she would travel by train across America and see the whole country. But she was sent to Oregon, where she stayed and became our first full-time Japanese language instructor. She published her class notes on a book that was very popular in the 1980s, 1990s. She married an American. Her son became a doctor on campus. And one thing Professor McLean has said that I've heard other women say, that study abroad changed their lives in unexpected ways. She had no clue she'd be teaching Japanese in Oregon. So very quickly, I could go on about several amazing women. Pictured here is Kyoko Selden and Noriko Mizuta on the campus of Yale University. Both Professor Selden and Mizuta became eminent professors, and they collaborated on translations of Japanese women writers. Professor Fumiko Ikawa-Smith receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award for her work in Canadian Japanese studies. Or in the bottom in color is Professor Ino, president of Tsuda University and an eminent scholar of Canadian history. And at the top in sepia is Akiko Suzuki, Japan's first licensed occupational therapist. Next to her is Sumiko Iwao, a psychologist who studied female exchange students, and Akiko Minato in the newspaper article, having met her husband on the Hikaru Maru, but that's not her most notable achievement. She's been president of at least 2 universities. Librarians are often an unsung force in knowledge curation. Takikawa Hideko helped curate the Aoyama Gakuin Junior College's collection of American children's literature. She wrote a book of, published her letters she wrote to her mother while she was studying at Bryn Mawr College. Women also filled other knowledge gaps. There was a demand to learn English conversation, but no place to learn it, especially if you were not a student. So some students founded English conversation schools in the 1960s and 70s. Not all women became academics. Here is Toshiko Delia, the world's oldest marathon runner, who began running races at age 44. Kimura was a dancer for Martha Graham, and Koyano Sensei, Professor Koyano, is a pioneer in art conservation, and she's restored world-famous artworks. So how does study abroad affect women's lives? What does it say about international relations? From the small sampling of a large group of women demonstrates that study abroad students were instrumental in forging US-Japan cultural relations in the early Cold War era and in advancing women's equality. As students, they were cultural ambassadors, receiving more media attention than the men. Again, here you notice them appearing in kimono. Being bilingual and able to trade in cultural knowledge, they were seen as representing a peaceful, domesticated Japan. And they show how women have often been cast as roles as mediators, and women's education a tenet of democracy. Many of these women became professors who have forever changed the knowledge of the world, and they exemplify the variety of work women have done in the 50s and 60s. Whether they realize it or not, their work was highly political. Thank you for listening. Thank you.